On 4 May 1945, while the front lines of the Third Reich were already collapsing into fragments of disconnected resistance, an encrypted naval signal left the headquarters of Karl Dönitz, at that moment still formally acting as head of state and supreme commander of the Kriegsmarine. The order was concise, technical, and devoid of rhetoric. All German submarines were to cease offensive operations immediately, surface, transmit their positions on agreed frequencies, destroy classified materials, and proceed to designated Allied ports for surrender. For hundreds of U-boats still at sea, scattered across the Atlantic, Arctic, Baltic, and North Sea, the message marked an irreversible transition from combat mission to administrative liquidation. Inside pressure hulls that still carried the smells of diesel fuel, battery acid, and unwashed bodies, commanders assembled their crews and read aloud a directive that stripped the boats of any remaining strategic purpose. Surfacing was no longer a tactical risk calculation, but a compulsory act of submission, one that exposed vessels designed for invisibility to constant observation. The mechanics of surrender unfolded with methodical precision. Submarines approaching British-controlled waters were directed to specific anchorages such as Loch Erebol and Lizahally, where Allied escorts took control of navigation and communications. Upon arrival, crews were ordered to stand on deck while boarding parties secured the vessel, disabled weapon systems, and sealed critical compartments. Torpedoes were unloaded, firing circuits disconnected, deck guns rendered inoperable, and radio equipment isolated. Particular attention was given to documentation. Patrol logs, engine room journals, damage reports, and code materials were confiscated, catalogued, and transferred to naval intelligence units. The submarine, once an autonomous combat platform operating under strict secrecy, was reduced within hours to an inert object governed by checklists, guards, and written protocols. Control rooms became inspection spaces. Command authority shifted decisively from German officers to Allied administrators. What emerged during these weeks was not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a bureaucratic process unprecedented in scale. By early June 1945, more than 150 U-boats had surrendered intact, each requiring storage, supervision, technical assessment, and political decisions regarding its ultimate fate. The fleet no longer represented a military threat, yet it posed a logistical and symbolic problem that could not be ignored. Every hull at anchor embodied years of industrial effort and ideological warfare, now awaiting disposal instructions that had not yet been finalized. As Allied officers filled out forms and issued temporary orders, one unresolved question hovered over every surrendered boat: whether these submarines would be studied, divided, or destroyed entirely. A question deliberately postponed, but one that would soon define the next phase of their existence. By the summer of 1945, the German submarine fleet existed in two parallel realities, human and mechanical, both equally depleted and both subject to external control. The crews, removed from their boats within hours of surrender, were transferred to temporary holding camps administered by British and American naval authorities, where the rhythm of submarine life was replaced by interrogations, medical inspections, and long periods of enforced waiting. Many submariners were barely out of adolescence, shaped by years of compressed service in a branch with the highest casualty rate of the war, and now confronted with a future that offered neither honor nor clarity. Intelligence officers questioned commanders, engineers, and radio operators separately, seeking technical data rather than personal confessions, battery endurance figures, snorkel reliability, diesel failure rates, acoustic signatures, repair improvisations. The men were not treated as criminals, but neither were they regarded as soldiers with a continuing role. They were sources of information to be exhausted, documented, and eventually repatriated into a country that no longer functioned as a state. At the same time, Allied technical teams moved systematically through the surrendered submarines themselves.
What they found contradicted many wartime assumptions about a coherent, resilient underwater fleet. The majority of boats showed severe material fatigue, pressure hulls stressed by repeated depth charge attacks, batteries degraded by years of deep discharge cycles, engines operating far beyond intended service limits, and electrical systems compromised by moisture and corrosion. Spare parts shortages during the final years of the war had forced crews to cannibalize equipment, improvise repairs, and accept progressive loss of performance as normal. In several cases, crews had sabotaged their own vessels before surrender, misaligning valves, damaging sensors, or disabling auxiliary systems to prevent immediate reuse. Fuel tanks were often nearly empty, lubricants contaminated, and safety margins exhausted. These boats could float and be towed, but many could not reliably operate under their own power without extensive refitting. The convergence of these human and technical conditions led Allied planners to a blunt assessment. The U-boat fleet was no longer a weapon, nor even a reserve force, but a liability. Guarding hundreds of prisoners and maintaining dozens of deteriorating submarines required resources that post-war Europe could scarcely afford. The submariners themselves, once the elite of a prestige service, were now redundant personnel awaiting transport home to ruined cities and uncertain civilian lives. Meanwhile, the submarines lay idle at anchor, their steel hulls slowly rusting, consuming dock space and attention while offering little immediate value. The question was no longer how these boats had fought, but how quickly and decisively they could be removed from the equation altogether. A calculation that would soon produce a policy answer, both final and uncompromising.
By late summer 1945, the unresolved status of the surrendered submarines had hardened into a policy decision shaped less by curiosity than by cost, risk, and symbolism. Within the British Admiralty, internal memoranda concluded that the majority of captured U-boats were neither economically viable to maintain nor politically acceptable to preserve. They represented a defeated enemy's most recognizable weapon system, one that could not be integrated quietly into peacetime structures without provoking controversy or suspicion. The result was Operation Deadlight, a program conceived not as an improvised cleanup, but as a systematic act of removal. Its objective was unambiguous: to eliminate the physical mass of the German submarine fleet and thereby close the material chapter of the Atlantic War. The mechanics of Deadlight were deliberately procedural. Selected submarines were stripped of remaining equipment, assigned towing numbers, and scheduled for transfer from holding anchorages in Northern Ireland and Scotland to designated deep-water sinking areas in the North Atlantic. British tugs, often undermanned and operating in poor weather, were tasked with moving hulls that were already structurally compromised. The operation quickly exposed the true condition of the fleet. Tow lines snapped under strain, ballast systems malfunctioned, and hulls flooded unexpectedly through worn seals and neglected fittings. A significant number of submarines never reached their intended disposal zones, sinking prematurely during transit and forcing ad hoc documentation of their final positions. Others arrived only to require repeated attempts at scuttling, as their degraded structures resisted controlled sinking procedures. From an administrative perspective, these losses were acceptable. The Admiralty's priority was not precision, but finality. Depth charges and naval gunfire were used to complete the process, ensuring that no hull remained recoverable or easily accessible. Each sinking was logged, coordinates recorded, and the vessel removed from active registers. There were no ceremonies, no public announcements, and no commemorations. Deadlight was executed quietly, framed internally as a necessary sanitary measure rather than an act of historical consequence. In doing so, the Allies effectively transformed the U-boat fleet into a series of underwater wreck sites, inaccessible and invisible, severed from both future utility and public memory. Yet even as the last scheduled sinkings were carried out, Deadlight was never total.
A small number of submarines were deliberately excluded, retained for technical evaluation and experimental trials. These exceptions were not anomalies, but indicators that destruction was only one strand of Allied policy. The fleet was being erased in bulk, but selectively preserved in parts, hinting that beneath the language of disposal lay a parallel agenda of extraction and appropriation. The chapter closed with most U-boats descending into cold Atlantic darkness, while a few remained afloat under guard, awaiting a different and more consequential fate.
Against the background of systematic destruction, a limited number of German submarines were quietly removed from the deadlight lists and reassigned a different status. These boats were not spared out of sentiment or scarcity, but because Allied naval planners identified them as repositories of future relevance. Central among them were the late war designs that had never fully entered operational service, the Type 21 and the smaller Type 23. Unlike earlier U-boats, whose concepts dated back to the interwar period, these vessels embodied a doctrinal shift toward sustained submerged operations. Streamlined hulls, greatly expanded battery capacity, advanced electric propulsion, and reduced reliance on surface running placed them conceptually closer to post-war submarines than to the boats that had fought the Atlantic campaign. Allied interest was practical and immediate. Selected submarines were towed to naval bases in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, where technical teams dismantled them system by system. Hull forms were measured, propulsion arrangements mapped, internal layouts analyzed with particular attention to crew efficiency and endurance. The emphasis was not on replicating the boats intact, but on extracting principles: hydrodynamic efficiency at submerged speed, battery management, noise reduction, and integration of snorkel operations into standard doctrine. Test runs and trials confirmed that these designs offered performance characteristics unmatched by existing Allied submarines, particularly in underwater speed and endurance. The preservation of these boats created an implicit hierarchy within the defeated fleet. Most U-boats were treated as obsolete debris to be erased, while a select few were elevated to the status of experimental platforms. This distinction reflected a broader shift in naval thinking. The war had demonstrated that surface-dependent submarines were increasingly vulnerable, while underwater endurance and stealth would define future conflicts. German engineers, operating under wartime pressure and with limited resources, had nevertheless anticipated this transition. Their solutions, developed for a regime that no longer existed, were now being repurposed by the victors. The process was conducted with minimal publicity. Reports were classified, trials unannounced, and findings circulated internally within naval research establishments. The former enemy's technology was being absorbed without acknowledgement, stripped of ideological context, and reclassified as neutral innovation. By the end of the 1940s, the direct physical presence of these German boats began to disappear as well, scrapped after testing or relegated to static use. What remained were design philosophies embedded in new construction programs, influencing submarine fleets that would soon face each other across emerging Cold War fault lines. The submarines themselves were fading from view, but their technical legacy was already migrating into a new strategic environment, one defined less by total war than by permanent preparation. As the physical destruction of the German submarine fleet progressed and selected vessels were isolated for technical study, a parallel administrative process unfolded behind closed doors. In late 1945, responsibility for allocating the remaining operational U-boats was transferred to the Trilateral Naval Commission, composed of representatives from the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Formally, its mandate was narrow and procedural: to supervise inspection, classification, and equitable distribution of surrendered submarines among the victorious powers. In practice, the Commission became one of the earliest arenas in which wartime alliance gave way to strategic rivalry. Each delegation approached the process not as a closing act of cooperation, but as an opportunity to secure advantages in an uncertain post-war future.
The allocation itself followed a numerical logic designed to project fairness. Submarines deemed seaworthy were divided into national quotas, transferred under escort, and re-registered under new flags. Yet the real value of these vessels lay not in their immediate operational use, but in what they revealed. Every transfer included exhaustive documentation exchanges, technical briefings, and intelligence summaries, as each side sought to learn not only from the submarines it received, but also from those assigned to its former allies. Mutual suspicion shaped even routine procedures. Inspection reports were disputed, classifications challenged, and access to certain systems restricted, reflecting an emerging lack of trust that contrasted sharply with the still recent memory of joint victory. Nowhere was this tension more evident than in the Soviet approach. Soviet naval engineers treated their allocated U-boats not as temporary acquisitions, but as templates. German hull forms, propulsion concepts, and internal arrangements were analyzed with the explicit intention of replication. What had been captured as trophies of war were rapidly transformed into foundations for a renewed submarine program, one aligned with the strategic priorities of a continental power seeking maritime reach. Western observers aware of this process responded in kind, accelerating their own research and development programs. German technology thus became a catalyst, feeding an arms competition that neither side publicly acknowledged but both actively prepared for. By the late 1940s, the practical utility of the surviving U-boats diminished. Many were scrapped after trials, others relegated to training or experimental rules before being quietly disposed of. Yet their strategic impact outlasted their physical presence. The distribution process revealed that the end of the submarine war had not produced consensus, but rather redistributed expertise into competing systems. The same boats that had once prowled the Atlantic under a single command were now fragmented across rival navies, their design principles embedded in future fleets aimed not at Germany, but at each other. The transition was subtle, bureaucratic, and largely invisible to the public, but it marked a decisive shift. The German U-boat fleet had ceased to be a defeated weapon and had instead become one of the first resources of the Cold War. Its legacy no longer tied to the past conflict, but to the tensions that were already taking shape.
By the early 1950s, the administrative life cycle of the German submarine fleet had effectively ended. The remaining boats had been scrapped, sunk, or exhausted as experimental platforms, leaving behind a scattered material residue and a far more complex problem of interpretation. What persisted was not a fleet, but a set of choices about memory. A small number of submarines were preserved as museum exhibits, stripped of weapons and context, presented as technical artifacts rather than instruments of a destructive campaign. Their interiors were cleaned, lighting installed, explanatory plaques mounted, guiding visitors through pressure hulls that once housed crews living under constant threat. In these controlled environments, the U-boat was reframed as an object of engineering history, its strategic purpose softened by distance and curatorial language. In contrast, the majority of submarines rested where Operation Deadlight had consigned them, on the seabed, unmarked and largely forgotten. These wrecks formed vast underwater graveyards in the North Atlantic, inaccessible to all but specialized expeditions and rarely acknowledged in public discourse. There were no monuments above them, no official commemorations, only coordinates in naval archives and corroding steel dissolving slowly into the seabed. This absence was not accidental. By removing the physical presence of the fleet from everyday visibility, the victors ensured that the U-boat war would fade from immediate memory, detached from contemporary political debates and moral accounting. Over time, historical narratives adjusted accordingly. The submarine war came to be discussed increasingly through the lenses of technology and tactics rather than ideology and consequence. Academic studies focused on design evolution, sonar countermeasure cycles, and hydrodynamic innovation, while popular culture selectively romanticized endurance and isolation. The administrative decisions of 1945 had shaped this outcome decisively. By destroying most submarines and isolating the rest behind museum glass, Allied authorities controlled not only the material legacy of the U-boat fleet, but also the framework through which it would be remembered. The transformation was complete.
A force created for strategic annihilation had been dismantled through paperwork, towing schedules, and policy memoranda, its remnants redistributed between exhibition halls and ocean floors. What survived was neither victory nor defeat, but a managed silence. The German submarine fleet did not end in a final battle or formal ceremony. It dissolved into records, wrecks, and curated spaces where meaning was assigned long after the steel itself had lost relevance. In this quiet conclusion lay the final irony of the U-boat war. A technology designed to operate unseen was ultimately erased by being hidden again, not beneath the waves of conflict, but beneath layers of administrative decision and historical distance, leaving behind questions that remain submerged but not resolved.